The cosmos knew her name, Velthara Velis, Empress of the Zephyrian Ascendancy, ruler of 1,000 worlds, and a being so powerful that even the gods whispered her name in reverence. She was no mere queen. She was a force of nature, a celestial goddess draped in living starlight, untouchable, untamed, and utterly without equal. Her skin shimmered like polished silver, her hair a flowing cascade of cosmic mist, and her eyes, those luminous abyssal voids, held the dying echoes of entire civilizations. To stand in her presence was to kneel. To meet her gaze was to surrender. No one dared defy her, and no one ever reached her heart. For centuries, suitors from across the galaxy had come, kneeling in awe, swearing eternal devotion, offering their planets, their legions, their very lives, to win a fraction of her favor. None succeeded. Velthara did not feel. She did not love. She did not break. Then he came, a man who should not have existed in her world. A creature so insignificant that even the lowest Zyphorian considered his kind beneath notice. A human. His name was Dane Corrin, and he entered her throne room in chains. The doors of the celestial hall groaned open, their sheer weight a testament to the grandeur of the Zyphorian capital. The chamber itself was an impossible cathedral of light and power, columns stretching to infinity, walls alive with swirling galaxies encased in crystalline structures. The floor was a reflection of the cosmos itself, a surface so pristine it mirrored the universe above. 100 Zyphorian enforcers escorted the prisoner forward, their armor gleaming with the ethereal glow of their empress's presence. He should have trembled. He should have knelt, but he did neither. Dane Corrin stood his ground, his shackled wrists resting at his sides, his battle-worn face showing no sign of fear. His eyes, a piercing shade of storm gray, locked onto hers with a boldness she had never encountered before. Velthara rose from her throne, descending the celestial steps with a grace that defied gravity itself. Her mere presence warped the air, bending light and space around her in an aura of unchallenged supremacy. A mere human should have collapsed under the weight of it. Dane did not. Instead, he smirked. A smirk. No mortal had ever dared such insolence. Her voice was a blade of liquid steel as she spoke. "You are in the presence of Velthara Velis, Empress of the Zephyrian Ascendancy, Keeper of the Starborn Throne, and Ruler of the Celestial Dominion. Do you understand what that means, human?" Dane tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, in a voice so maddeningly casual it sent a ripple of shock through her court, he replied, "Yeah, means you've got too many titles." A silence fell over the throne room. A deadly, absolute silence. Her counselors stiffened. Her enforcers shifted their stances, waiting for the inevitable command to obliterate this disrespectful creature. But Velthara, she did nothing, because, for the first time in centuries, she felt something foreign stir in her chest. Not anger, not fury, amusement. "Interesting," she murmured, descending another step, her silver eyes narrowing as she studied him. Most creatures who stood before her wept, groveled, or screamed for mercy. Yet this man, this human, met her gaze with something she had never witnessed before. Defiance, and worse, intrigue. She had lived through countless millennia. She had seen the rise and fall of entire civilizations, had watched suns collapse and galaxies be born anew. She had known absolute power, had crushed rebellions with a flick of her wrist, had ended wars with a single whisper. And yet, in this moment, standing before a mortal who should have been nothing more than dust beneath her feet, Velthara Velis felt her world shift, just a little, and that was dangerous. For if there was one truth in all the stars, it was this: she was untouchable. And yet somehow, she suspected Dane Corrin was about to change that, forever. Velthara did not order his execution. Not yet. The fact that she hadn't puzzled her court, and even herself, but she pushed aside the thought. Instead, she chose to study this human anomaly, to unravel the mystery of Dane Corin before deciding what to do with him. He was brought to the lower levels of her palace, a place where prisoners of interest were held, not in cells, but in containment spheres, suspended mid-air by gravitational energy. The force fields ensured there was no means of escape, no way to break free. She visited him the next evening. The containment chamber was silent, save for the faint hum of energy rippling across the room. Dane sat cross-legged within his sphere, his arms resting on his knees, his expression unreadable. Velthara stood before the shimmering field, watching him. "You should be afraid," she said finally. Dane glanced at her unimpressed. "Am I supposed to be?" Her gaze darkened. "You are in the heart of my empire. You are surrounded by beings who could disintegrate you with a mere thought. Your life is entirely in my hands." He exhaled slowly, as if contemplating her words. Then, with a lazy shrug, he said, "Yeah, but you haven't killed me yet." It was infuriating. The audacity, the sheer recklessness. Velthara had faced warlords, rogue gods, and celestial entities that could devour planets whole. They had all crumbled before her power. They had all feared her. But this human? He smirked at her. She stepped closer to the force field, the glow of it illuminating her silver skin. "What were you doing on my ship?" Dane held her gaze. "Looking for something." She raised an eyebrow. "And what would a human possibly hope to find aboard a Zyphorian dreadnought?" A reason. A flicker of something passed through his storm-gray eyes. A shadow of something deeper, something heavy. He wasn't just another reckless fool stumbling through the cosmos. There was intent behind his actions, something personal. Velthara folded her arms. "And did you find it?" Dane let out a dry chuckle. "Not exactly, but I found you instead, and that's interesting." Her lips parted slightly at his words. Interesting. The way he said it. The way he looked at her. Not as a goddess, not as an empress, but as something else. The air in the chamber thickened. For a brief moment, Velthara felt something dangerous slip through her carefully maintained control. Curiosity, intrigue, the faintest pulse of excitement at the way he refused to cower, at the way he challenged her. It had been centuries since she had felt anything remotely close to being intrigued by another being. With a flick of her fingers, the containment field shimmered, then vanished. Dane landed on the ground gracefully, rubbing his wrists as if expecting to still be bound. He looked up at her, watching her with the same unreadable expression. "You are either the most foolish creature I have ever encountered," she said, stepping closer, "or the most dangerous." Dane tilted his head. "Funny. I was about to say the same about you." Velthara could have ended him in that moment. She could have crushed him beneath the weight of her power, broken his mind, erased his very existence. And yet, instead of destroying him, she turned and walked away. A silent command rang through the chamber. "Follow." And Dane, reckless and unyielding, as ever, did pour. Velthara did not understand why she let him live. She could have ended his existence in 1,000 ways, erased him from the annals of history with a mere thought. Yet, instead of execution, she had given him freedom, within her palace at least. The human was now a guest, not a prisoner. Her court whispered behind closed doors. Her council demanded an explanation. The High Order of Zyphorian urged her to dispose of the disruption before it tainted her judgment. She ignored them all. Instead, she watched him. Dane Corin was not like any creature she had encountered before. He wasn't afraid. Even among her highest officials, there was always an unspoken reverence, an awareness of her supremacy. Yet Dane spoke to her without hesitation, without calculation, without the weight of worship in his voice. It was both infuriating and, though she refused to admit it, addictive. One evening, as she walked the hanging gardens of Zyphorian Prime, she found him there. The gardens stretched across floating platforms suspended in the sky, with luminous flora that pulsed in shades of violet and sapphire. Massive celestial waterfalls cascaded into the void, their currents woven with strands of starlight. Dane stood at the edge of one of the platforms, gazing up at the binary moons above. "You could have tried to escape," she said, approaching him. He turned, hands in his pockets, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "Could have, but I didn't." She studied him, her gaze piercing. "Why?" Dane leaned against the ornate railing, considering his answer. "You don't strike me as someone who lets people live for no reason." Velthara's expression didn't change. "Perhaps I wish to study you further." "Or perhaps," Dane said, stepping closer, "you're tired of ruling over people who only fear you." She stilled. The words sank in deeper than they should have. He continued, his voice softer now. "Power like yours. I bet no one ever tells you the truth, do they? No one ever challenges you. No one ever treats you like anything other than an untouchable goddess." She kept her face unreadable. "Because I am untouchable." Dane's storm-gray eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Yeah? Then why haven't you sent me to die yet?" Her fingers curled at her sides. "Because you amuse me, human." Dane let out a soft chuckle. "Right. Amusement." She could feel it, the shift. A change in the air between them, something unspoken settling into the space they shared. He was too close now, close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence, the pulse of his mortal heart. No one ever stood this close to her, no one ever dared. She should have stepped away. She should have reminded him of what she was, reminded him that she could end him with a flick of her wrist. But instead, she stayed. For the first time in centuries, Velthara allowed someone to stand within reach, and for the first time in her entire existence, she wondered if being untouchable was truly what she wanted anymore. Velthara had ruled for millennia, untouchable and indifferent. Yet now she stood in the gardens of Zyphorian Prime, aware of something she had never allowed herself to feel before, the pull of something unknown, something dangerous. Dane Corrin was a human, an anomaly, a creature so insignificant in the grand scheme of the cosmos that she should have discarded him without a second thought. And yet, here he stood, beside her, unaffected by the weight of her presence, looking at her not as a goddess, not as a ruler, but as something else. She turned away from him, folding her arms as she gazed over the luminous waterfalls cascading into the abyss. "Do you know why no one stands as close to me as you do?" she asked. Dane, leaning casually against the railing, smirked. "Because they're smart?" She shot him a sidelong glance, unimpressed. "Because I do not allow them to." "Then why me?" The question hung in the air between them, the weight of it pressing into her like an unseen force. Velthara should not have entertained such thoughts. She was above this, above him, above all of them. She had been sculpted from celestial power, crafted to rule, never to feel. And yet. "You intrigue me," she admitted at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Dane let out a quiet chuckle. "That's what you said before. It remains true." There was a silence that stretched between them, neither speaking, neither looking at each other, yet both aware of the storm growing in the space they shared. Dane was the one to break it. "You ever wonder if being untouchable is just another kind of loneliness?" Velthara's jaw tightened, her gaze fixed on the stars above. "I am not lonely." "Liar," he murmured. She turned sharply, her silver eyes flashing with the faintest trace of something dangerous. Careful, human. Dane didn't shrink away. He never did. Instead, he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, his storm-gray eyes locked onto hers. You can wipe out fleets, command entire civilizations, control forces most species can't even comprehend, he said, his voice steady. But when was the last time you let someone in? When was the last time you let someone see the person behind the goddess? Her breath caught. It was the wrong question, or maybe it was the right one. She had spent eternity reigning above all things, and in all that time she had never once questioned what it meant to be seen. Dane reached out, not in a challenge, not in defiance, but in understanding. She did not stop him. His fingers brushed against her hand, and for the first time in her existence, Velthara felt something other than power flow through her. Warmth, not cosmic, not divine, human warmth. And she did not pull away. The realization hit her like a collapsing star. Dane Corran was not supposed to matter. He was not supposed to make her feel anything. But as his fingers tightened slightly around hers, she knew the truth. She had spent eternity above all, and now, for the first time, she was falling. Velthara had survived wars that shattered entire civilizations. She had outlived gods and empires, watched stars collapse and galaxies be born anew. She had seen it all, felt nothing, remained above it all. Until now. Until him. Dane Corran was not a god. He was not a celestial being, nor a warrior of legend. He was human, fragile, reckless, utterly insignificant in the grand scheme of the cosmos. And yet, he was the only one who had ever touched her. Not with fear, not with worship, with understanding. The moment his fingers brushed hers in the gardens, something within her fractured. It was not a wound, nor a weakness, but a crack in the armor she had worn for eternity. She had told herself it was curiosity, nothing more, a fleeting indulgence before she discarded him like the rest. But as the days passed, she realized a truth she could not ignore. Dane was changing her, and it terrified her. She had tried to keep her distance, had ordered him confined to the guest quarters in her palace, had refused to see him, to acknowledge him. Yet here she was, standing in the shadows of her own throne room, watching as he leaned against the balcony, staring up at the twin moons of Xiphorian Prime. She did not speak, but he knew she was there. "You always watch from a distance," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet. Velthara stepped forward, her silver hair catching the moonlight. "You speak as if you know me, human." Dane turned to face her. "I think I do." A slow, deliberate silence stretched between them. Velthara was the first to break it. "You overestimate your significance." Dane chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I think you underestimate what it means to actually let someone in." She should have been furious. She should have reminded him who she was, what she was, that he was nothing more than a mortal standing before a being who could erase him with a flick of her hand. But instead, she took another step closer. "You are reckless," she murmured. Dane tilted his head, smirking. "Yeah, and you like that." She stilled. It was the truth she wasn't ready to face. The warmth she had felt in the gardens returned, stronger now, burning through the walls she had spent eons constructing. Dane watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he stepped forward. Too close, closer than anyone had ever dared. She did not move. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Tell me to leave." She should have. She had every reason to. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She closed the distance. Their lips met, a collision of opposites, of power and mortality, of a ruler who had never known weakness, and a man who had never known fear. For the first time, Velthara Velis, Empress of the Zyphorian Ascendancy, Goddess of the Stars, Untouchable, Queen of the Cosmos, felt human, and the universe itself seemed to tremble. Velthara had spent an eternity untouched, untouchable. But the moment she kissed Dane Corrin, the moment she let herself fall, she knew there was no going back. He wasn't like the others. He hadn't worshipped her. He hadn't feared her. He had seen her, not as a goddess, not as an empress, but as a woman. And that made him dangerous. Not because of his defiance, not because of his recklessness, because he had become her weakness. She had never known fear before. True fear. Not the kind that came from battle or betrayal, but the kind that came from having something to lose. Now she understood it, because she knew the Zyphorian High Council would never allow this, and she knew what they would do next. The attack came at dawn. Velthara woke to the sound of alarms reverberating through the palace. Her mind snapped to clarity in an instant. Something was wrong. She reached out, her celestial senses stretching across the vast halls of her domain, and then she felt it. Dane. He was in danger. She moved before thought, a blur of silver and starlight as she raced through the corridors. When she reached the main chamber, she saw them, Zyphorian enforcers, elite warriors clad in radiant battle armor, their weapons trained on a single figure. Dane. He stood in the center of the chamber, his hands in fists, his jaw clenched. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, but he remained standing, unbroken. Her council stood above him, their expressions grim. "This cannot continue." "Your Radiance," one of them said, his voice cold. "He is a disruption, a corruption." Velthara stepped forward, and the temperature in the chamber dropped. The very air trembled as gravity itself warped in response to her fury. "You dare act against my decree?" Her voice was ice, sharp enough to cut through steel. The council remained firm. "We act for the good of the Empire. You are not yourself. You have been compromised. As if feeling made her weak, as if loving made her lesser. Dane's voice broke through the tension. "Velthara," he said, quiet but steady. She turned to him. His eyes met hers, and she knew what he was about to do. No, but before she could stop him, Dane took a step forward. Toward her. Toward them. "I won't let them take everything from you," he murmured. "Not because of me." Her heart clenched, a sensation she had never known until now. Dane turned to the council. "Let her rule. Let her empire stand. But if you see me as a threat, then I'll make this easy for you." And then he was gone. In the blink of an eye, a pulse of raw energy erupted from the chamber. A teleportation breach. He had activated an emergency escape beacon, one she hadn't sensed, hadn't seen, because he had planned this. He had left. Not because he wanted to. Because he thought it would save her. Velthara stood frozen, the silence pressing down on her like the weight of dying stars. The council believed they had won. But they were wrong. Because she would find him. She was Velthara Velis, Empress of the Zyphorian Ascendancy, Queen of the Stars. And now, for the first time in eternity, she had something worth chasing. The universe had taken him from her, and she would tear apart the cosmos to get him back 4-0.